Quite often we need to group a bunch of elements for styling purposes. For example, here on adobe.com, look at this navigation bar on the top. In this navigation bar, we have an image and a bunch of menu items. So this navigation bar is a container for these elements. Here is another example. This is what we call a hero unit. This hero unit has a background image, a heading, some text, and a couple links. Here are more examples. Another container, and so on. So containers are used quite a lot in web pages. Let me show you how you can work with them. So in HTML, we have a few different container elements. The one that is most commonly used is the div or division element. Now this element doesn't have any visual appearance. So if you save the changes and go back to the browser, we see nothing because this is purely a container element. So here I'm going to add a paragraph and a hyperlink. Now let's save the changes and go back to the browser. Once again, we don't see the div. We only see the text and the hyperlink. But we can use CSS to style this div. So here I'm going to set the background color to gold. Now, take a look. See what's happening? This div, this container, is filling up the entire width of the page, even though it has very little content. Why is this happening? Well, because the div element is a block level element. Block level elements always start on a new line and fill up the entire available space. So if we duplicate this div, the new div will appear on a new line. Let me show you how to do this. So I'm going to select these few lines. Now to duplicate these lines, we hold down the Shift, Alt, and the down arrow. Okay, save the changes and take a look. So block level elements start on a new line and fill up the entire available space. But we can use CSS to change their width. So over here, we can set the width to 300 pixels. Now take a look. Here's what we get. That's better. So this is all about divs. Now we have another generic container element called the span element, which is often used for styling text. Let me show you how it works. So I'm going to delete all this code. Now let's add a paragraph with some text. Let's say we want to highlight the first word here. We can wrap this word with a div, give that div a class like highlight, and then define a CSS rule for setting the background color of highlight elements. So let's wrap this with a div. Now we give this element a class like highlight, and then define a rule here for elements with a highlight class. Here we can set the background color to yellow. Let's see what we get. See what happened? Can you explain why we're getting this weird layout? Because divs are block level elements. So we wrap this word with a div, and this div is filling up the entire width of the page. This is where we can use the span element. The span element is a generic container like a div, but it's not a block level element. It's an inline element, which means it's not going to take up the entire width of the page. So back to the code, we want to replace both these div tags with a span. Let me show you another useful shortcut. So I've selected this div. Now to select the second div, we can press Command and D on Mac or Control and D on Windows. Look, now we have multiple cursors. So we can replace both these tags in one go. We just type span and then press the escape button twice to disable multi-cursor editing, okay? So now let's save the changes and back to the browser. Look, the first word is highlighted. So this is how we can use divs and spans. But in HTML5, we have a few more container elements that are more descriptive. Alright, let's see how we can create a basic form. So we start with the form element. Now every form should have an action. This is used for submitting the form, but we'll talk about this later. So let's remove this attribute for now. Now inside this form, we're going to have one or more input fields, also called form controls. So we can add an input element. Each input element has a type. If we set the type to text, we get a single line text field. So take a look. Here's what we get. Now we can always work on styling this. We can make the corners round. We can make this bigger. We can change the border color or border size. We'll talk about that in the next lesson. Now, before each input field, we want to have a label. So some people use a paragraph element here to add the label. Here's what we get. But there are a couple of problems with this approach. The first problem is this extra space below the label. The label is somehow disconnected from our input field. Now, I know we can use CSS to remove the space, but there is a better solution. If we replace the paragraph element with a label, let's see what happens. So in between the opening and closing tags, we type our label like name. Now, the space is gone and these elements are laid out horizontally because label elements are inline. Now, every label element has a for attribute. With this attribute, we can associate this label with this input field. So we give this input field a unique identifier like name, and then use the same value for the for attribute of the label. Now, when we click on the label, the input field gets focus. So labels make your forms more accessible or more usable. Alright, now let's select these two lines and duplicate them to add another field. So I'm going to call the second field email. Obviously here we need to change this attribute to email and this one as well. Now if we set the type attribute of the input field to email, we get basic validation in this field. So when we try to submit the form, if we don't supply a valid email address, we'll get an error. We'll talk about that later in the section. So let's see what we get. Here's the email field, but quite often we want to lay these fields vertically. We have a few solutions for that. We can wrap the label and its associated input field inside a div or a paragraph or a list item. So I've selected these two lines. Now let's bring up the command palette. In case you forgot the shortcut, it's right here under the view menu. So Shift, Command, and P on Mac. Now we type wrap and wrap these two lines with a div. Now we're going to select the next two elements and once again wrap them with a div. So here's the final structure. Now our form fields are laid out vertically. That's much better. The final is add a submit button here. So back to our form, after the second div, we're going to add a button. Now each button has a type. If we set this to submit, this will be used for submitting the form. We can also set this to reset. This will clear all the values in the form. So I'm going to add two buttons. The first one is going to be submit. And here in between the tags, we type the label for the button like register. Now let's duplicate this. For the second button, I'm going to change the label to clear and the type to reset. So here's the result. If I type something here and then click on clear, the form gets automatically cleared. So this is the basic structure for a form.